Hey guys, this video is sponsored by SteelSeries, so make sure to stick around after the end to find out how you can get a discount on your next order. Bright Memory Infinite is like Devil May Cry, Bulletstorm, Shadow Warrior, and Dynasty Warriors all rolled into one. It's a sequel or a follow-up, I guess, to Bright Memory, an FPS which came out last year and was pretty much developed by a single guy, letting you play as a badass soldier named Sheila, taking on a terrorist organization when she transports herself to this mysterious floating island.
Where am I?
Yeah, honestly, the plot didn't make a lick of sense, and it wasn't really trying to either. It was just really giving you a reason for getting from point A to B, and it was the gameplay that made Bright Memory so unique, despite the fact that it was otherwise incredibly bare bones, lasting barely an hour. It was a cool combination of guns and swordplay, utilizing various powers and abilities to rack up combos, and shred through groups of enemy soldiers and these undead creatures. Bosses were these giant, lumbering abominations taking cues from Chinese mythology, and it was schlocky, ham-fisted, and laughably over the top. Not to mention, it combined two of my favourite things, waifus and big guns.
How amazing!
Well, Sonny Jim, here we are now with the follow-up, Bright Memory Infinite. And the good news is, if you already own the prologue, well, then you can get this thing for free, which is pretty awesome. Considering I'd kinda struggle to think up a figure that'd be fair to spend on this thing given its short length. Yeah, it should be worth saying right off the bat that this is a really short game. My first playthrough took me around 90 minutes, and subsequent playthroughs were a similar time frame as well. There's very little here in the way of unlockables outside of cosmetic outfits, so if you're coming in here expecting a 6 to 8 hour long game, well, you're going to be disappointed. But I mean, still, considering it's coming out around the same time as Call of Duty Current Year Edition, I'd honestly say that this is a much better investment. So, the year is 2036, and you're once again hopping into the shoes of Sheila, working for the SRO, who are trying to uncover the meaning behind all of these strange events happening throughout the world. The whole thing kicks off with Sheila just hanging out in her display suite looking apartment, wearing booty shorts that look a couple of sizes too small, before she's then called in by her superiors to investigate an electrical storm in the sky. Turns out inside this storm is a mysterious floating island separated from the rest of reality. Oops, there goes gravity. And to make matters worse, it also seems to be the epicenter for a black hole. Yeah, and you don't need to be no rocket surgeon to tell that black holes that close to civilization's gonna be bad news.
Understood.
Now this is just my perception of what's going on here, because to be honest, Bright Memory's story feels like if you started watching a Netflix series from like the 3rd season in. It's got all these characters and factions, just without any explanation as to what the whole thing means, who everyone is, or what you're actually really supposed to be doing. And the brief cinematics you get throughout the campaign aren't exactly helping put the pieces together. This kinda made sense during the prologue because that really was more like a tech demo / proof of concept than an actual game. But Infinite's had much more time in the oven, so to speak, so for there to still not be any proper explanation for what's happening is a bit disappointing. It really just feels like a thinly veiled way to get things going, which is fine. I mean, I'm here to kick bubblegum and chew ass. But just don't expect there to be any kind of revelations or even a satisfying conclusion to what is going on.
Understood.
The ending is abrupt and downright disappointing, like so many other things in my life. Visually, I think Bright Memory Infinite is actually pretty impressive. It makes good use of ray tracing with lots of slick surfaces covered in water, casting various reflections, and it also runs really well too thanks to Nvidia's DLSS. I mean, I might have had a few dips here and there, but with everything maxed out, the game did really well to hold itself around 144 frames per second. And there's a whole heap of visual options to play around with here anyway, so I can't imagine it's going to be all that hard to get it working on your own rig. Just make sure you turn off motion blur, otherwise I don't think we can be friends anymore. Sheila's character model does look a bit basic, and her alternate outfits look like fan-made mods for a game like Fallout 4. But a lot of the enemies, especially these more mythical variants, are highly detailed and they look really awesome. The scale of some of these boss fights is also pretty impressive, giving me these old school Painkiller vibes, and there's some neat effects during these as well. Gotta say though, I don't know if these are taken from an asset store or something. I know a lot of Unreal Engine 4 games often have these library assets coming out of their ass. But this sort of setting does feel really unique, and it's a lot different to walking through the same looking forest at sunrise or sunset in all those other games using this same engine. I mean, honestly, if I have to play through another Unreal Engine 4 game set in some kind of generic looking forest, well, I might actually have to end things. The weather effects look great too. It's raining almost constantly throughout the campaign. There's a lot of wind, making the trees and the leaves sway around constantly, and it just really captures the feeling of being on this floating precipice that feels like this gateway between worlds. So yeah man, for a game put together by a few people inside what I expect would be an office the size of a broom closet, the whole thing manages to look pretty damn good. Gameplay is pretty simple. You move from one area to the next, getting locked into one spot, then you've got to kill a few waves of spawning enemies before you can progress onward. Enemies are either these military looking guys, or all of these reanimated monsters and mythical creatures that kind of feel like something out of a From Software game. Movement feels slick and responsive, and is pretty much par for the course these days. You can dash around by pressing shift, and it really does kind of feel at times like your survivability just kind of depends on how quickly you can mash that shift button. Wall running's also a thing, though for what reason I have no idea. You only have to do it a handful of times here, and it's never during combat anyway, so it's more or less just for platforming in between all of these combat sequences. Then there's also a double jump, which is pretty standard, and sprinting, which can be turned into a cool looking slide move if you press crouch. It's nothing new, just the kind of features we've come to expect at this point. And it works well, so I don't see any real point in shitting on it. Sadly though, there's not all that much verticality or even complexity to these environments. I mean, they look good, but most of them are just these simple arenas that might have a few pieces of cover, so it's pretty basic stuff. The boss fights are really just a matter of keeping your distance while pumping away with your most powerful attacks and weapons. I mean, it's a long way from using jump pads or leading groups of enemies on controlled routes through the area. Everything's just often on the same level as the player. When it comes to the guns, just don't set your expectations too high here. I mean, this is a painfully simple roster with the amount of weapons you can count on one hand. You begin with an assault rifle, which looks like it could have been taken out of any modern shooter made in the last decade. It's got a reflex sight, because of course it does, and it does pretty decent damage against most of the basic enemies.
Schwacked.
Shortly after that, you'll find the automatic shotgun. Now this thing's got a drum magazine and obviously a higher damage per shot, but its reload time leaves a lot to be desired. And it's expectedly only good at shooting someone at point blank range. At which point though, your sword or your fists often make for a much better alternative. Next up, there's an automatic pistol, which looks like something out of Apex Legends. I mean, Sheila even kind of holds it slightly to the side. Then finally, a sniper rifle, which does really high damage, and I just found to be super useful during some of the bosses. Yeah, believe me when I say this thing's gonna carry you through some of those fights. Then to spruce all of these up a bit, these weapons also have highly powerful alternate fire modes. The assault rifle can fire out these exploding projectiles that home in on nearby enemies, again a pretty good boss buster. The shotgun can fire out incendiary shells. The pistol turns into a grenade launcher because, yeah, that makes sense. And then the sniper rifle fires exploding rounds that stick into enemies before detonating shortly after. I mean, why they don't just blow up and impact is anyone's guess. It's admittedly a pretty short roster, but it does feel like they've gone for quality over quantity here, and I never felt like any of these were useless, which is saying something. Especially at a time when most games just throw a bazillion weapons at the player, and then hope that the sheer numbers makes up for the otherwise complete lack of variety. Honestly, I found the gunplay to feel a lot like the recent Call of Duty games. It's got a really fast ADS speed, those tactical over-the-top reload animations, and even these eyesore weapon skins, down to being able to unlock gold skins after you kill a certain amount of enemies. But shooting things alone's gonna get boring pretty quickly, and it's the sword and Sheila's exo-arm fist where things start to really kick off, and also where I see that Shadow Warrior and Bulletstorm influence that I mentioned earlier. There's not really all that much to say about the sword here, but just mash that E button like your life depends on it. Able to upgrade it too so it launches out these little blades of energy that are useful for attacking at range. Hold the E button down instead and you can launch enemies up into the air, priming them for some follow-up attacks. The fist on the other hand is bound to F, and pressing this once sends out this kinetic blast called the EMP, which aside from just instantly obliterating these weaker enemies, also suspends the tougher enemies in place for a few seconds, again setting them up for follow-up attacks. This also kind of reminded me a lot of Shatter from Rage 2, so I guess we can also add that one to the growing list of games that Bright Memory seems to have taken influence from. On the other hand, hold the F button down and it works like a lasso, pulling enemies in towards you, which sounds a lot like a certain other game involving lots of references to male genitalia, doesn't it? Yeah, the game calls this thing a tractor beam, which I guess makes sense, but it's really just the same as the lasso, and it even has a similar animation. But then it also goes further than that, because holding down either E or F when sprinting has different effects for each weapon too. With the sword, you can launch out this spinning whirlwind, which homes in on enemies for a few seconds. Again, another really useful attack against the bosses. Do this with the fist though, and it lets you rocket punch enemies, which is exactly what it sounds like. And then even jumping and holding down these buttons again has its own unique effects. So it's a pretty neat way of squeezing extra value out of what's essentially just 2 buttons. Then finally, you can also block with the sword, parrying certain enemy attacks if the timing is right, and outright deflecting bullets right back at the person firing them. Though, for some reason, the sporadic firing rate of enemies means that you spend a lot of time just kinda standing there holding the sword up and waiting for them to shoot.
Almost there!
Certain enemy types have a shield bar you need to whittle down before you can even actually drain their health, so learning the timing of all these attacks is really important. You might want to rebind the controls for this thing though, because someone thought it'd be a good idea to map this to the tab key by default. And you know what happens in Steam games when you press shift and tab at the same time? Yeah, it really just feels like a control scheme designed with a controller in mind. I did actually try to play it with a controller for a bit to test this out too, and I did find that the melee stuff was a lot easier. But then I also found that my aim suffered as a result, so I guess you've got to decide what's more important. There is definitely a period of time here too before all of this stuff clicks. I know that when I played the prologue, it took me like a good solid hour or so of playtime before I finally got the hang of things. And I found the same thing here again too with Infinite. In fact, I'd say that I didn't even really enjoy myself all that much for the first playthrough. It's like I could see what I was able to do, but the muscle memory for what I had to press just hadn't quite kicked in yet.
Ow! Motherfucker, even a dick!
Having said all that, despite there being a fair few ways you can deal with the enemies, on the other hand, you're also somewhat limited because of this arbitrary energy bar that every one of your abilities relies on. So I mentioned how the sword can be used to launch enemies up in the air and how the exo arm can essentially do the same thing, right? And if you're used to games that utilize air juggling, well, you might want to get creative here. Once the enemy's up in the air, you might want to slash him a few times with the sword, add a couple of shotgun shells in for good measure, then maybe combine it with the ground slam with the fist. Or maybe even keep going with the EMP and suspend them up there for even longer, stacking damage up as you keep the combos going on and on. The only thing is that you can't do this, because you've already expended so much suit energy getting them up there that you can't use any other abilities after this. It'd be like, imagine if in Doom Eternal, right, the chainsaw, the flame belch, the ice bomb and the grenade all use the same energy source. It'd make the combat a whole lot less open-ended, right? Well, yeah, and that's what's happened here. Now, the prologue had a different way of handling this, putting each ability on a cooldown, which is actually kind of more skillful to manage. And although it is a bit more complex, it just kind of felt like chaining attacks together was much more viable. In comparison now with Infinite, it just never feels like you're able to pull off this perfect sequence of abilities chained one after the other. As you make kills or collect resources, you can buy upgrades to increase the damage these do, the range they have and all that stuff, but there's no upgrades for your overall energy pool. So you're always working off this basic limitation.
Okay.
But you know what really pisses me off the most here with this game? The ranged enemies. Now, I've expressed my hatred for these kind of enemies in the past, and it always pisses me off to no end when you've got a game with a melee system involving blocking and parrying. Then they add in these marksman enemies with bows or rifles who hang back on a rooftop somewhere shooting at you. I was a big fan of Elderborn that came out a while back. It was a super cool first-person melee game where you were fighting all these guys with swords and hammers. And throughout this perfectly balanced combat system, your rhythm would be thrown off constantly because some fucking asshole threw a spear at you. And it's again how it kind of feels to me in Bright Memory. You'll be dealing with these tough muchachos, timing your parries and dodging like a Chad, only to suddenly catch an arrow in the ass from some douchebag you weren't even aware of. These ranged enemies almost always require your immediate focus because of just how quickly they can whittle away your health, especially on the higher difficulty modes. And seeing as there's no point to try to get in for a stylish kill, you've often just got to revert to simply killing them in the quickest way possible. These undead enemies with the bows are easily the most annoying. They shoot out these fire arrows that do really high damage. And they're always spawned in during boss fights at the worst possible times. Really, it seems only as a last ditch effort to mess with the player. I think the combat's at its best here when you're taking on the tougher enemies, the ones armed with a shield or some kind of huge axe or something, who all have these really hard-hitting attacks that you have to parry with the right timing. I don't know, man, it's just kind of a slight blemish on what's otherwise a pretty cool combat system. There are a few other mild design choices that also had me scratching my head, and here they are.
Understood.
I mean, for starters, considering how short the whole thing is, it is surprising to me that they threw in this mandatory stealth section in the second level.
Gotcha, bitch!
Where you've got to sneak past enemies and can only kill them with these preset takedown animations like we're back in 2010. This whole stealth sequence is like stopping someone in the middle of a car chase and making sure they're still wearing their seatbelt. And somehow no one noticed that the model for the cleaver you're using literally covers up what is in front of you.
I guess you didn't see that, did you?
It's just that old chestnut for stealth mechanics where you simply crouch in the bushes and then prevent a meter from filling up so enemies can detect you. Because if you're seen, it's an instant game over.
Of course!
And it's just a dumb idea, right when you're getting into the swing of things, to suddenly force the player to now crouch, walk and stay out of sight, avoiding enemies you obliterated by the truckload only mere minutes earlier.
The enemy vehicle is gone. Keep moving.
Then there's a really weird section where you're suddenly attacked by all of these pigs. Yeah, and this just feels out of place. Later on, there's a short car sequence which has one of the worst controls for shooting missiles in a vehicle I think I've ever seen. I mean, honestly, can you think of a single other game where you control a rocket launcher in a car, but can only shoot straight ahead of the vehicle? I can't. Later on during this sequence too, you even run over a few more pigs that happen to be standing in the road minding their own business. Like seriously, what does this guy have against pigs? As you'd hope for any good waifu game, you can also dress Sheila up in a bunch of different outfits. Though I do have to say I think it's pretty messed up how they've locked the best ones behind this DLC. DLC for a game that's gonna take you the better part of 2 hours to finish. I don't know, maybe that's been done as a way for them to try to recoup their losses for essentially giving this thing away. Considering I think 90% of people playing this are the people who already owned and played the prologue.
Of course!
Overall, I do think a lot of the criticism I can muster for Bright Memory Infinite is almost kind of unjustified considering the basis of the game itself.
What's wrong?
This is not a game made by a huge AAA developer or published by a huge powerhouse like EA or Activision or anything like that. Like the prologue, it's a fun little shooter made primarily I think by just one guy. There's a definite sense of progression here since the first one, and while it's not quite a full game yet, it's undeniably taken a step in the right direction. So you know what? I say, fuck it man, check it out. There's still a whole lot of soul in this one, despite its short length, and when the whole thing clicks, I guarantee you're going to have more fun with it than you will with Call of Duty 2021 edition. At the end of the day, I'll always have a soft spot in my heart for games made by these smaller indie devs, and when they happen to throw badass waifus in there too, along with guns, swords, and nice looking explosions, well then that spot gets even softer. And then when they finally make Bright Memory 3, you can pull out your hipster card and tell everyone you were there back when this thing was only small time. Right, so if you're still watching, well, thanks for sticking around, and let me give a final shout out to my sponsor, SteelSeries. SteelSeries makes some of the best gaming peripherals from headsets, keyboards, mice, and gaming pads, all synced together with a handy program that lets you modify the hell out of them. I'm a bit of a stickler for high quality mouses and keyboards, and whether you're playing a game that's 8 months old or 8 years old, it makes a huge difference in how well something handles. I would never recommend something that I don't use myself, and I'm pretty stoked to be able to offer a discount to people looking at buying some new gear. So just make sure to use that Chad promo code GMAN at checkout to get 12% off your next order. And as always, thanks for watching.